Hey folks, Roland Martin here. I'm going to talk about the very first bass tournament that I ever won. That 1970 Seminole bass tournament at Lake Seminole, Georgia. And I won it on this plug. Now I want to just show you something on this plug here. This is the Jim Strader Diamond Rattler. And this is a lure that I started fishing with back in the 60s, in the late 67, 68, 69. Jim Strader came to the Lake Okeechobee. I'm sorry, it wasn't Lake Okeechobee, Lake Santee Cooper, where I was guiding on Lake Santee Cooper. And he really fell in love with me and the big fish that we were catching in the willow trees. Well, I used the same exact plug that I used at Santee Cooper to win the 1970 very first bass tournament I ever fished. Well, let me just tell you about it. It was really a cool deal. It was such a cool thing because what happened was I went down, there was no cutoff back then. This was early on. There was before cutoffs were even established, and so I had a whole month of free time because it was late January, early February. There wasn't much guiding. I was guiding on Santee Cooper at the time for both striped bass and largemouth bass. And anyway, I didn't have much work to do. So I figured I'd just go down to Lake Seminole. Ray Scott had finally talked me into fishing a tournament. I'd fished one in January on Lake Toledo Bend. I came in second. I had a pretty good start. So I was real reluctant to fish tournaments because I wanted to catch big fish. My whole goal was to, like on that picture there, these big 7 and 8 pound bass that I caught at Santee Cooper, I was hoping I could catch them in the tournaments. Well, anyway, I went to Lake Seminole a whole month early. And I had a good friend of mine, Odell Hare and Betty Hare. These were two big bass fishermen. In fact, Betty Hare went on to become one of the leading women tournament fishermen in the women's league. It was called B.A.S.S. and Gals. The B.A.S.S. and Gals tournament. Betty Hare won several tournaments. But anyway, Betty and Odell and I, we teamed up and said, listen, I'm going to fish a big tournament on Lake Seminole, and I got to go practice. So here they come. We went out to Spring Creek Flats. We started fishing topwater. We started fishing worms. We started fishing all the eelgrass beds and all the backwater places. And I was catching a few fish. It was a pretty good day, pretty good time. We even caught some really big 6 and 7 and 8 pound fish, not only in Lake Seminole, but a sister lake, Lake Talquin. We'd actually gone over there and practiced for a little while as well. But anyway, I spent the whole month practicing. Every day we went to a different area. Lake Seminole is like 40 or 50,000 acres. So one day I'd fish up Flint Creek. The next day I'd fish up Spring Creek. The next day I'd fish up the Chattahoochee River. The next day, Saunders Slough. So, all over the lake. Well, I stayed at Jack Wingate's camp. Now, Jack Wingate was a real character at the time. An older guy, he passed away a few years ago, but he did 3 radio shows every morning. He'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'd cut down at the marina at Wingate's Landing, and he'd be on the radio. He'd say, Roland, here, come and talk to us about how are you catching your fish. And so we'd do an interview with a radio station in Dothan, Alabama, a radio station in Tallahassee, Florida, and another station somewhere else. Anyway, every single morning, Jack would do his updates, his weekly reports on all these channels. And so I would come in, and back then we didn't have catch and release. You have to understand, in 1970, there was no catch and release. Every time you caught a big 7 or 8 or 9 pound bass, we brought it into to the weigh-in. In fact, we cleaned them, we ate them, and you go down to Wingate's cleaning table and you see these big carcasses, the great big heads of big 6 and 8 pound bass. Everybody would just cut their fillets off and eat them and fry them. And that's just the way bass fishing was. There was no catch and release. Anyway, Jack was really good with me, and he would interview me because I was bringing a lot of big fish in, a lot of big 6 and 7 and 8 pound bass, and he would talk to me and say, Roland, how'd you catch them? And so I told the radio audience from these 3 different stations every morning just how I caught the fish. Well, Jack Wingate at his lodge had an old man, Hester, Nestor, I can't remember exactly what his name was right now, but he was there every day. And he said, Roland, have you been over to Saunders Slough and back in that little area back there? He says, there's some beaver dams back there. Now, this was back years ago. If I showed you some aerial photographs of Seminole today, it's all grown up in reeds and rushes. But back then, it was a pretty new lake, and it was open. So you could get back, way back to where, say, beavers would be cutting trees down around the tree line. Now, it's not that way. You can't get that far back, even though it's just grown up in reeds and rushes. But back in 1970, the lake was open right back to the pine trees. And the beavers had come along, and on all some of those little creeks and stuff, they had built a little shallow dams across the deal. And as the lake would fluctuate up and down, on high water, the fish could get over the beaver dam, and in low water, they'd be back in the beaver dam. Well, anyway, this Mr. Nestor, I think it was his name, he said, try those beaver dams. And he showed me on a map about where the beaver dams were. In fact, what I'd done, I'd gone one step farther. At Santee Cooper, I'd gotten these aerial photographs from the Department of Agriculture and showed all the little potholes and all the little coves and creeks. And so I got those same maps for some of that Lake Seminole area. And both lakes, both Santee Cooper and Lake Seminole, have limestone sinks. Now, limestone sinks are depressions. It's a perfectly flat place. It's way back in the cove, and all of a sudden there's a hole, maybe 8 or 10 feet deep, and it's full of big live oaks. And so as you go back in these shallow flats, you could barely get back there, and all of a sudden there'll be a deep hole 8 or 10 feet deep, completely round, and that's where so many of those fish would be, back in the flats, in those limestone sinks with trees all around them. Anyway, Mr. Nestor said, go back and find these beaver dams. Well, I went back there, and I had this little old boat, and it had an 80 horsepower motor, and I'd run up to the dam. I couldn't get across the dam. So I got out of the boat. This was before the tournament. And I actually tore the beaver dams apart. I mean, I ripped them apart. It took me an hour, and I got in there where I could motor back, and the water's about 3 feet deep. I motored back into the beaver dam. Now, nobody would do that. I mean, I was the only one getting back into the beaver dam. And I took this plug, and I'd make long casts with this diamond rattler with 20-pound monofilament on a big old heavy rod, and bam, 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 I caught some really big 3 and 4 and 5, 6-pound bass. So anyway, it was really, really a cute story, because Mr. Nestor had told me all about these fish back in the beaver dams, and it was a really, really profitable thing, because back then, you know, we could practice just as long as we wanted to practice. So I spent a whole month practicing, and it was one of the Roland rules. In fact, I mentioned that before, that over the course of 40 or 50 years of tournament fishing, I ran the edge of propriety, whatever I could do. But going over a beaver dam was one of them. So that was kind of my big deal. I remember when I finally won the tournament was over, Ray Scott had asked me, he said, Roland, what do you attribute your success to? And I said, well, number one, Mr. Nestor helped me out a lot. He told me about these beaver dams way back in the swamp. And I got out and tore the beaver dams apart, got over into the beaver dams, and that was a big deal. And the other thing was I spent 30 days practicing. So it was really a cute tournament. It was my first tournament win, and it was really just a special time in my time. You know, I'd been an outdoor writer, and I'd been a photographer up to that point. And so I figured, you know, if I win tournaments and people get to know that I've won tournaments, maybe I could parlay this and I could use it as a springboard of opportunity. Now that I've been successful in the last 2 tournaments, I came in second at Toledo Bend and now first at Lake Seminole. Hey, maybe I can get something good going out of this. I can get maybe some good sponsors. In fact, my first sponsor was Jim Strader. He came along and said, okay, Roland, hey, we'll give you like a couple $1,000. It wasn't much. My second big sponsor was Ranger Boats. Now, I'd worked with Ranger and Forrest Wood. I'd met him the month before at Toledo Bend, and he liked me a lot. He got me into a Ranger boat, and so that was my first big sponsor, was Ranger Boats. But my first couple tournaments that I fished, I was on top of the game. I was fishing first, second. I was just really killing them. And so that was my story of my first tournament win. And listen, I post every Wednesday about 6 o'clock, and I post every Sunday about 6 o'clock, and then on Fridays I do an update. I talk all about what happens for the week, and this week was really special because today I was out YouTubing. I caught a 9.5-pound bass on a topwater plug. Not this plug, on a big devil's horse, just 2 hours ago. So let me tell you, old school works. Devil's horses work. John and Jim Strader plugs work. Topwater works. That's just one of the many patterns that I've been so enamored by. And watch the visual action of a topwater strike. There's nothing any better. Anyway, hey, listen, thanks for watching, and I really appreciate it. We'll see you again soon.